Hello makers, I'm Katherine from Minerva, and today we're going to stitch up the Norma Blouse from Fibremood. The Norma Blouse is a beginner-friendly sewing project. It is a woven blouse with some gorgeous puff sleeves that come to your elbow and a front button placket. And the best part is it only takes an afternoon to stitch up. Now, if you're going to make this, we have some kits available, and I will link them down below for you with a variety of different fabrics and everything that you need to stitch this up. So let's get into the supplies you'll need. So we are going to start off with this lovely cotton poplin by Rose and Hovell, and it is in this gorgeous ivory cream color with these beautiful bumblebees on here. Next up, we're going to have the paper pattern for the Norma Blouse right here. And then we are going to need some fusible interfacing to go along with that. And of course, we're going to have buttons going down the front placket, some needles, and matching thread. Now that you've gathered up all of your materials, be sure to pre-shrink your fabric by washing and drying it the way in which you're going to launder it. And let's get into stitching this up. So to start, we are going to interface the button placket and facing pieces. So you're just going to iron out your fabric to get out any wrinkles, and with the glue side down, so the one with the little dots on it, we are going to use some steam on our iron and press it. Now don't wiggle your iron around, lift it up and down. That way it prevents any creases in that interfacing. Now on to the shoulder and side seams here. So I have gone ahead and finished the outer edges of the side seams and the shoulder seams. I used my overlocker or serger, but you could just as easily use a zigzag stitch on your domestic machine. Next, with right sides together, I am going to pin the shoulder seams together, joining the front and back pieces. So once we get that all pinned up, we are just going to stitch that with our seam allowance. Next, we want it to lie nice and flat, so we are going to come in with the iron and some steam and just press those open. Now for the facings and the button placket, since it's an all-in-one. So we're going to join the front and back facings together at the shoulder seams. And of course, we're going to use that same seam allowance we did to attach the shoulder seams of the bodice. Press those seams open and it should look just like so. So I've gone ahead and overlocked the exterior edge of that facing, so the one that we are not going to be attaching to the front, so that outer edge of your button placket facing. Next, with right sides together, we are going to match up the shoulder seams first. And I'm just placing a pin on either side of the seam to, number one, hold it right along that center, and number two, keep those seams open. That way nothing gets tucked under when you're using two of those pins. Then go ahead and match up the center back as well as any of the notches that are along here. So we do have a couple of notches, and you will notice that the button placket facing pieces are going to be shorter at the front than the actual shirt itself. That is done on purpose. That is how we get a nice crisp edge along the hem. So do not fret if you notice that the facing pieces are slightly shorter. So go ahead and stitch, being sure to come out along the top and bottom. So let me walk you through what that looks like. So we're going to start at the edge, going out, and then pivot, and then now we're going to attach along the entire outside. So we're going to do that at the bottom edge of that facing on the front side, both at the very start of our stitching and at the end of the stitching. This helps to form that crisp corner for our bottom hem. So I'm just going along here and just stitching this in place and being careful to go slowly along the curves just to make sure everything is nice and precise. And as we continue to go along here, I wanted to show you also one last time how I finish off that end. So as we're approaching the end here, I'm just coming up along the neckline. So we're just going to pivot here. Now this is the front of that facing. So you can see we are coming up to where we need to pivot. So when you get to the end where that seam allowance is, put your needle down, pivot, and then go towards the end of that facing and then back stitch, just like so. So it should look like this. See how we come to the end and pivot right through there. Next, we are going to trim this. So I am just trimming the corners along that edge that we had pivoted, just so we don't have any bulk sitting at those corners when we turn them right side out. The next area that we need to clip is, of course, those curves. So we are going to clip along all of the curved edges, which happen to be that neckline edge. So I'm just going in here and notching out small little triangles as I go, and I'm keeping them closer together in the areas where it is a tighter curve, and you can spread it out a bit more on that more gentle curved area. So once you have all of that clipped out, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to press those seam allowances towards the facing. And then we are going to understitch going all the way around. So you can see that I have understitched here, but I can only go up to a certain point. And the point along those corners in the front, we won't get right to that point. That is okay. The understitching will still do its job. Next, take out a point turner or any, I guess, blunt object would do, and poke out those corners and then hit it with some iron. I love a point turner because you've got two ends to it, and I use that hooked end to get the top of this because it goes into that gentle curve of that V neckline. Then when we get to the back, you want to get out your pressing ham, or you're going to get some creases that you're going to press in your fabric over the shoulder line. Now, the purpose of this understitching is to ensure that the fabric rolls towards that wrong side and just helps everything lay perfectly flat. So do not skip that understitching and do not skip the pressing. The pressing is what helps to create that really polished garment at the end of the day. So once we have all of this pressed and ready to go, our blouse is really starting to come together. We've got that beautifully finished edge along the placket. Next, I am going to stitch in the ditch along the shoulder seam to hold the placket in place. Now for the sleeves. So with our sleeves, I have finished the edges along the underarm edge of the sleeve with overlocking, and then we are going to run a long basting stitch along the top of the sleeve cap. And make sure you pull up that bobbin thread. That way you have the bobbin tail to pull when we want to cinch this in. So to do the 2 rows, you want them to be within that seam allowance. So I'm going to do my narrow row here. We're starting at the double notch and then going to the second single notch. Leave a nice good tail, and then I like to flip my fabric over, and rather than starting at the double notch, I'm actually starting at that single notch. So I'm stitching in both directions. I find that this gives a more even gather when you start at one side and then go to the other than if you're using the exact same direction each time. So now let's attach that sleeve. So you want to make sure that they are right sides together and then match up the single notch on the sleeve to the front single notch on the bodice piece. The single notch in the center of the sleeve cap goes to the shoulder seam, and then the double notch on the back of the sleeve goes to, you guessed it, the back of the bodice. Once you've pinned those in place at those 3 points, then you can start to pull the bobbin threads on those gathering stitches to evenly distribute those gathers along the sleeve cap. And I like to pull from the one end going towards the center, and this ensures that we have even gathering throughout that sleeve cap, and it works absolutely beautifully every time. And then I just go in and add a couple of pins just to make sure that all of the gathers that we have put in place don't shift around. Then go ahead, stitch it in place, and I went ahead and overlocked the edges, or you can zigzag them. And this is what our sleeve will look like so far. So the next thing that we're going to do is those underarm sleeves here. So we're going to place them right side together. You'll also notice I'm working with a directional fabric. So I made sure that all of my bees were going in the same direction when I cut them out. So do be sure to pay attention to that if you have a directional fabric. Next, I am going to start by pinning that underarm sleeve because we want it to match up. And then I just go ahead and distribute the pins going across that underarm area in the side seam and stitch it up. And because we've already finished them with either an overlocker or zigzag, we are going to press these seams open, which helps everything to lay nice and flat. So I am going to be using my seam roll to go in here and prevent any creases that might occur. I'm just pushing it through here, going up, and this fabric with the cotton poplin holds this press absolutely beautifully, which I absolutely love. It's always so satisfying when you have a fabric that really holds a nice crisp press. Now for the sleeve cuff. Now this is a narrow piece of fabric and probably the most fiddly part of the entire construction. So I've pressed it in half, and then along the short ends, I'm going to stitch them right sides together to form a loop. Now the reason I pressed it in half first is it just makes it so much easier to form that cuff. Next, grab your sleeve roll. This is going to be crucial for helping you to get it pressed right. You're actually going to press that little tiny seam up towards the center. Yes, it is very fiddly, very small, but it is totally doable. Now you can do it without a sleeve roll. You could roll up a face cloth and use that as your seam roll. You just want something there so that you're not pressing down on the backside of this tiny little tube here. So I'm going in, I'm folding it where it needs to be, and then just hitting it with a nice good amount of steam and heat. Next, I have taken the liberty of sewing 2 rows of gathering stitches along the bottom of the sleeve. Then I am going to match up the band right here with the open raw edge, so not the edge that we just folded under, to the inside of the sleeve. I know, it is not what you would usually think, but bear with me here, you will see it all come together. Now the reason why we're starting on the inside with this is because at the end of the day, we are going to flip it back to the right side and we're going to top stitch along that folded edge. And you want your top stitching to be as neat as possible, hence the reason we're starting on that inside. So I'm just gathering everything up on my sleeve cap. I basically quartered it and then pulled those gathering stitches to evenly distribute the gathers. And so you can see that I've got it just like so. And then what you're going to do is fold over that folded edge that we had to cover that raw edge of the seam allowance. So I went ahead and did that here, and I've pinned it in place. And then I went ahead and top stitched it. So this is what it's going to look like. The seam that we stitched first is actually along the edge, and then it just folds over to cover those seam allowances. Beautiful. Now for the hem. So with this, you've already got a good idea of where that hem is going to be based on that initial placket that we stitched. And you're just going to continue to follow that. Now you can use your seam gauge to get it absolutely perfect. I am eyeballing it just because I have a good idea of where it needs to be. Then go ahead and fold under about 1/4 inch so that you're containing all of those raw edges along the bottom of your fabric. And so I'm just going across and folding all of that in just like so. And make sure you use some pins. Now, if you are using pins as you are using your iron, use glass head pins. The plastic pins, they're going to melt. So be sure that you have those glass head pins if you're doing what I'm doing. And then go ahead and top stitch it. Now for the buttons and finishing details. So we've got that hem all finished, and now it's for the button placket. So we have these buttons. I am just going to use my gauge to determine how far apart I should place my buttons. This is just a helpful tool that really speeds things up, but you could go ahead and measure it just as easily with a ruler. So I just figured out how many buttons I want to include along here. And I am just marking that with a water-soluble marker. And I'm marking the center of the buttons, and then I like to go ahead and mark where my buttonholes are going to be. So I'm actually marking the center of my buttonholes when I do that. So you can see I've got these beautiful kind of whitey cream colored buttons, which go perfectly with this. I am just matching up my seam gauge, and then I am placing the edge of that seam gauge along the folded edge to make sure that I have them evenly spaced away from that folded edge. It's just a little trick that I like to do. Stitch those buttonholes and attach the buttons. And I just wanted to show you, I like to use a buttonhole chisel and mallet to do my buttonholes rather than a seam ripper, because I have had a bad experience where I cut a hole in my fabric. And I've already went ahead and attached those buttons. And so now we can test out those buttonholes and get them all done up here. And our blouse is completely done. And it looks so cute with all our bees going in the same direction. Let's get to that reveal.
Let it go, what's the use in holding on? Can we find a way where we could spend some time alone? You know where to find me, you know which way to go. As long as you love me, we'll be singing all night long. So take a minute to hold me. I want nothing more than your arms and to be your baby tonight.
And there you have it. We have stitched up the Norma blouse. That was nice and quick, and I hope you enjoyed the sew along. Now, if you have any questions at all, do leave them in the comments down below, and we will be sure to get back to you as soon as we can. And if you haven't done so already, consider creating an account here on Minerva. It is free to join, and it is a great place to share your videos and photos of all things that you have created within the sewing and knitting world, as well as connect with other makers. And if you want to visit my profile on Minerva, you can find me at Sheer Stitchery, and I'll also link that down below. Until next time, makers.